Tell me, what is a musical composition that perfectly uses the various instruments of the orchestra to tell its story? None other than Peter and the Wolf. Composed by Sergei Prokofiev in 1936, he managed to cleverly weave a simple story that made a memorable impact because of its recognizable melodies and how he utilized musical instruments. Each character is given their own section or instrument that represents them, and it does not take long for us to know which is which, even without visual accompaniment. Peter is performed by strings like violins and cellos, which gives us this unforgettable tune. In the story, Peter hangs about with three animals. A bird is appropriately played by the fluttering sound of the flute. The waddling sound of the duck is performed by an oboe. And the sneaky cat that follows the avian characters around is played by a clarinet. When Peter's domineering grandfather walks out to lecture him, he is represented by the low groans of the bassoon. And then, when the wolf finally shows up, we hear the French horn, plotting and planning on how to eat the duck and other animals. Finally, following a lot of tumbles and conflict, the hunters come in, aided by the booming sound of the woodwind instruments and percussion drums. When the story reaches its conclusion, all the instruments converge for a glorious final march. Surprisingly, the original performance of Peter and the Wolf was not very successful, but history has shown that it has since gained a sizable enough audience to receive a large number of adaptations. Now, because there are so many versions out there, I'm going to focus on 3. Otherwise, I'm going to be here all day. Probably the most well-known adaptation is the Disney version, which appeared in the package feature Make Mine Music. Narrated by Sterling Holloway, this utilizes that classic Disney animation in reimagining the story while still using the right instrumentals. They throw in quite a bit of that slapstick in there, yet it's very funny and still respects the source material and tells it very well. I particularly want to compliment the character designs, which are in that Disney style, but they nonetheless keep an appropriately Russian feel to the segment's appearance. While yes, it is the mouse doing the usual take that will ultimately take over the original story in many people's minds, it's still a well-made effort on their part. Many years later, a television special was created based on composition. It has these typical corny 90s live-action segments with Lloyd Bridges and Kirstie Alley telling the story, but what makes it worth a look are the cute animated scenes. With characters designed by Chuck Jones and animated at Cosgrove Hall in England, it's got its own set of charms. Those expecting the usual Jones slapstick animation won't exactly find that here, but as an animated telling of the story, it works well enough. It's definitely aimed at a younger audience, but it's not a bad way to introduce them to the music. Interesting enough, the setting has changed from Russia to a Swedish-like meadow. However, the change in location does not affect the film too much. A recent incarnation of Peter and the Wolf came in the form of Susie Templeton's Academy Award-winning short. Told with some impressive stop-motion animation and set in present day, it's definitely one of the darker takes I've seen of the material. It expands on the story by having Peter dealing with some bullies, and it's tied in well with the wolf later on. And in an interesting twist from the usual incarnations, Peter actually lets the wolf go in the end. The character designs on the animals are also different from what's usually seen. The cat is more tubby than the usually slender figure given to him in later adaptations. The whole film has that great patchwork look to it, on both the sets and characters. Everything looks so lovingly stitched and sewed together, to fantastic effect, and the Oscar this short won was greatly deserved. Peter and the Wolf is a timeless story with fantastic use of instruments, and which will certainly be adapted many times over the years. If you've never given it a listen or seen some of the different film versions out there, it's certainly a composition that's worth giving a try. It certainly will not leave your head for a very long while.